She showed her ticket, but the flight attendant didn't even look. People stared as she was told to move to the back. She said nothing, but someone else was already watching. By the time the plane landed, every passenger knew exactly who she was. And the woman who humiliated her had no idea what she'd just done. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this. Marla Trenwood sat quietly in seat 2D, her small purse tucked under her legs, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look like someone trying to be noticed. Her sweater was plain, her shoes were old but clean, and her gray hair was tied back in a short, simple braid. She glanced around the first-class cabin with the quiet curiosity of someone who had never been there before. The seat was softer than she expected. A soft chime played overhead as the last few passengers boarded. Marla turned her eyes to the window, watching the workers outside load suitcases into the belly of the plane. She smiled slightly. Her son had surprised her with this ticket for her 66th birthday. "You've never flown first class," he had said. "You deserve it." She had hesitated at first, but he insisted. So here she was, alone, a little nervous, but proud. Then she heard heels clicking toward her aisle. A woman's voice rang out sharp and cold. "You can't be in first class." Marla turned her head slowly. The flight attendant standing over her was tall, with dark lipstick and hair pulled tight into a bun. Her name tag read, Erica. She stared at Marla like she had seen a stranger wandering into the wrong party. Passengers turned to look. Some froze mid-conversation. Others watched with quiet amusement. Marla cleared her throat, gently pulling her printed ticket from her coat pocket. "I believe this is my seat," she said softly, holding it out. Erica barely glanced at it. "This must be a mistake. You need to move to coach. Now, please." Her voice got louder on the word, now. A man in the next row looked away, pretending not to hear. Marla's cheeks burned. Her hands shook slightly as she held the ticket out again. "My son bought this for me. He said it was all set." Erica let out a sigh that carried enough weight to silence the rest of the cabin. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up and follow me. You're holding up the boarding process." Marla's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The cabin had gone quiet. She stood slowly, picked up her purse, and stepped into the aisle without another word. Marla walked down the aisle with her eyes low, trying not to notice the stairs. Every step felt heavy, like she was dragging something behind her. The flight attendant didn't say another word, just pointed toward the back without even looking. Marla found an empty seat near the rear of the plane, beside a window that hadn't been cleaned properly. She sat down slowly, adjusting her sweater and tucking her purse beneath the seat again. The space was tighter. Her knees almost touched the seat in front of her. The cushion felt thin. A young man in the next seat gave her a quick nod, then turned back to his phone. No one asked her what happened. No one offered to help. She looked out the window, her hands still trembling. Her throat felt tight, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a picture of her son, Everett Trenwood, smiling in front of his office building. She opened their text thread and typed with slow, careful fingers. "They made me move, said I didn't belong in that seat. I showed my ticket, but she didn't believe me." A moment passed, then another. Finally, 3 little dots appeared. "What do you mean they made you move?" Marla read the message 3 times before she replied. "The woman said I couldn't sit there, loud enough for everyone to hear. She didn't even read my ticket, just told me to leave." This time, the reply came fast. "What's the flight number?" She looked down at her boarding pass and typed it out. The message sent with a quiet whoosh. She placed the phone face down on her lap and leaned back. Her chest felt tight. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had sat where the ticket told her to sit. She had followed the rules. But none of that mattered. Not to that woman. Not to anyone who watched and stayed silent. The plane doors closed with a soft thud, sealing in the stillness that hung in the cabin. Marla stared at the back of the seat in front of her, barely blinking. She could still hear the sound of the attendant's voice in her head, sharp, certain, as if Marla's presence in first class had been some kind of threat. She wasn't used to that tone. Not after all the years she had spent listening to patients, calming frightened families, and holding the hands of strangers during long nights in hospital rooms. She had worked quietly for decades, never asking for praise, never demanding recognition. She didn't think she had to prove herself anymore. The man beside her sneezed into his sleeve, then leaned over. "Excuse me, ma'am. Did you get bumped from your seat or something?" Marla forced a small smile. Something like that. He nodded slowly, clearly sensing there was more but didn't press. That was fine with her. She wasn't in the mood to explain what it felt like to be treated like a problem. The engines rumbled softly as the plane began to taxi. Marla clutched her seatbelt, her knuckles pale. She had flown many times before, but this felt different. Everything around her, the people, the space, even the air, felt heavier now, like she had shrunk somehow, like she had lost something she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed again. She flipped it over quickly. "Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything." She stared at those words from Everett. He didn't use many of them when he was angry. He didn't need to. When he was upset, he became quieter, more focused. The kind of quiet that filled boardrooms and made people sit straighter in their chairs. She didn't know what he was planning. She didn't even know if there was anything he could do. But reading his message gave her a small bit of air in her lungs again. At the front of the plane, flight attendant Erica walked the first-class aisle with a coffee pot in hand, her lips pulled tight in a professional smile. She bent to pour a cup for a businessman in a navy blazer, then straightened and smoothed her skirt. She moved confidently, proud of how she had cleaned up the seating before takeoff. The old woman had been out of place. Erica was sure of it. People didn't just buy first-class seats looking like that. She didn't feel guilty. She felt efficient. In the galley, the junior attendant, her name tag read Ray, stood by the beverage cart, fidgeting with a stack of napkins. She had seen what happened, had heard the tone, had watched the old woman walk away quietly, without raising her voice once. Ray kept folding the napkins one after another, unsure whether to say anything. Erica had seniority. She had worked for the airline longer than Ray had even been out of school. But still, something about the way the woman had left, shoulders hunched, face flushed, stuck with her. Back in the last row of the plane, Marla leaned her head against the window. The plane began to rise into the sky, and her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Her son had told her this trip was to celebrate, to relax, to feel special. Instead, she sat in a seat that smelled faintly of peanuts and cold air, while her rightful one stayed empty, or worse, given to someone who hadn't been questioned at all. Marla stayed pressed against the window long after the plane leveled out. The seatbelt sign had turned off, and the flight attendants began moving about, but she didn't shift. Her hands remained still in her lap, fingers clasped tightly together, thumbs twitching slightly with every small movement of the plane. The hum of the engines and the occasional clink of cutlery from the forward cabin filled the silence around her. She didn't touch the small water bottle in the seat pocket. She didn't even pull down the tray table. She just stared. She thought about getting up and going to the restroom, not because she needed to, but just to breathe. But something kept her rooted in that seat. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shame, or maybe it was the fear that if she stood up, the eyes would follow her again, the judgment, the stares, the quiet suspicion that she was out of place. The worst part wasn't that Erica had asked her to move. It was how she said it. Loud, firm, with no space left for doubt or explanation, as if Marla didn't deserve even 5 seconds of respect. There had been no mistake in tone, no confusion. Erica hadn't just seen her as a lost old woman. She had seen her as a problem to be removed. Marla kept hearing her own voice in her head, quiet, small, almost apologetic. "My son bought this for me." That line echoed like it belonged to someone else, someone weaker, someone who needed to justify her worth. She hated that. She hated that she had said it. Why did she feel the need to explain anything? She shifted in her seat slightly and noticed the man beside her scrolling through a sports article on his phone. He seemed relaxed, unbothered, just another traveler in another uncomfortable seat. For him, this was just another flight. But for her, this was something she wouldn't forget. Not because she wanted to hold a grudge, but because something in her had cracked a little when she was told, in front of so many strangers, that she didn't belong. Her phone buzzed softly again. She picked it up quickly, heart tightening. Everett. Did she check your ID or just your appearance? She stared at the message. No greeting, no emojis, no exclamation points. That's how she knew he was really upset. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Marla. She looked at the ticket barely. Didn't ask for ID, didn't scan anything, just assumed. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then came back. Everett. And no one said anything? She hesitated. That question stung more than the others. Marla. No, everyone just watched, or pretended not to. There was a long pause after that. She imagined Everett sitting at his desk, staring at his phone with that clenched jaw of his. She could see him now, in the tall leather chair she'd once teased him about, in the corner office on the top floor of that glass building with his name on the plaque outside. People always assumed he was a lawyer or maybe in tech. They never guessed what he actually did. She looked down at her ticket again, still folded neatly in her pocket. It said 2D in clear print. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't walked into the wrong cabin or tried to sneak past anyone. Everything had been in order, but none of it had mattered. Not to Erica. She looked back at the reflection in the window. Her face, caught in the dull afternoon light, seemed tired. Not just from travel, but from years of staying quiet when people like Erica crossed lines. She had raised a good man, a strong one, but she had taught him to keep his head high, to stay measured, to pick his moments wisely. Now it seemed he was picking one, and whatever he was planning, she knew it wouldn't be loud, not Everett. He didn't do loud, he did permanent. Up front, Erica moved down the aisle of first class like nothing had happened. Her shoes clicked softly against the carpet. Her posture was perfect. Her uniform still looked crisp and tight. She topped off a man's wine glass and handed another passenger a folded blanket, smiling just enough to be polite. But inside, there was a buzz, quiet, familiar, and smug. She'd handled the situation just like she always did. She was the one keeping order, making sure people were where they were supposed to be. That older woman had been in the wrong seat. That was that. Still, something itched at the back of her mind. Not guilt. Erica never let herself feel guilt during flights. But maybe discomfort. Maybe something closer to unease. The woman hadn't caused trouble, hadn't yelled, hadn't insisted. She had looked stunned, but not confused, just hurt. It had been in her eyes, something deep and buried, like someone used to being overlooked. Erica had seen it just for a second before she turned her back on it. She shook the thought off. The cabin looked orderly now, the way it should. The kind of passengers who belonged in first class were back to reading business magazines, sipping club soda, and asking for extra pillows. Things were in place. She convinced herself that was all that mattered. Back in economy, Ray stood near the rear galley, leaning against the silver cart with her arms crossed. She had been quiet since takeoff, offering drinks and snacks in practiced motions. But her mind wasn't quiet. She kept thinking about the woman, about how she had looked when she got out of that first-class seat. Small, embarrassed, alone. Ray didn't know much about her. Just that she looked like someone's grandmother, someone kind, someone who didn't deserve to be treated like she had done something wrong. Ray had worked under Erica for nearly a year, and she had seen her make snap judgments before, usually about people who didn't dress a certain way or who spoke with accents or who asked too many questions. But this time it felt different. It felt worse. It felt personal. She wanted to say something. She had almost stepped in. But when Erica had said, "You're holding up the boarding process," Ray froze. She had watched the woman gather her things and walk away in silence, and Ray had done nothing. Now, standing here, that silence felt louder than any voice. She hated how easy it had been to let it happen. At the same time, Marla sat in her narrow seat, holding her phone again. Her eyes skimmed over Everett's last message, still unread by anyone else, still private, still heavy. "I'll take care of it. You don't need to speak to her again." Marla's first reaction was relief. She trusted him. If Everett said he would handle it, he would. That was his nature. He was thoughtful and calm, but when he decided something needed to be fixed, he fixed it. No speeches, no raised voices, just action. But beneath the relief, something else crept in. Hesitation. She hadn't raised Everett to fight her battles. She had raised him to be smart, to be measured, to think through what others couldn't. And here she was, sitting in row 28, wondering if she had just handed him a reason to burn down a bridge. She didn't want revenge. That wasn't who she was. She just wanted it to matter that it had happened. She wanted someone, anyone, to look at Erica and say, "That wasn't right." Her thumb hovered over the keyboard again. She typed a message, then deleted it, typed it again. Don't do anything too harsh, just make her see it. She didn't send it. Instead, she looked out the window, searching for the clouds, but they had vanished. All that remained was gray sky and the soft rattle of the cart coming up the aisle. A baby cried 2 rows behind her. Someone sneezed nearby. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. In that moment, Marla didn't feel like a woman who had been kicked out of a seat. She felt like a mirror that someone refused to look into. Someone who had spent her life doing the quiet work, the kind people overlooked, the kind that didn't wear a suit or sit at a board table, the kind that people like Erica didn't bother to ask about. And now, the flight attendant who dismissed her so easily had no idea what was coming next. Erica poured herself a cup of coffee in the galley and stood for a moment, holding the paper cup in both hands. The liquid was too hot, but she didn't take a sip. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, lost in a blank stare. She had been in the industry for 11 years, flown every kind of route, dealt with every kind of passenger. She'd always prided herself on staying professional, composed, efficient. But lately, if she was honest, she had started to feel something different creeping in. Impatience. It came in small ways. A sigh she didn't hide. A sharp tone she didn't correct. She told herself she was just tired. People didn't follow rules. They got on planes acting entitled, demanding things, taking up her time. She had to manage it all, keep everything in check. No one thanked her for keeping order, but they all noticed when something went wrong. Still, today's situation hadn't felt like control. It hadn't even felt necessary. That woman, Marla. Erica hadn't known her name when she made her move, but she remembered her face. Soft, uncertain, dressed plainly, like someone who didn't expect to be seen. Something about it had irritated her on sight. She told herself it was about the ticket, about making sure the seat wasn't taken by mistake. But the truth was uglier, and she knew it even before the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Erica, please report to the cockpit." The words dropped into her stomach like cold water. She blinked once, twice, then turned stiffly toward the front of the plane. A few passengers looked up. One woman furrowed her brow, sensing the tone behind the announcement. Erica nodded at Ray without speaking and made her way toward the cockpit, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. She knocked lightly on the door, then stepped inside when the captain waved her in. He didn't greet her. His mouth was set in a firm line. Next to him, on the small screen mounted to the wall, a man's face filled the frame, calm, clean-shaven, wearing a tailored navy suit and thin-framed glasses. His expression wasn't angry. It was still, controlled. But there was something about the way he looked directly at her that made Erica's shoulders tighten. "Ms. Erica," the captain said, voice low. "This is Mr. Callan. He's patched in from the executive office." She nodded, unsure why her mouth had suddenly gone dry. Mr. Callan's voice came through clear and calm. "There's been a situation reported on your flight. A first-class passenger was removed from her seat. We need clarity." Erica swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. There was a woman in 2D. I didn't have her listed in the manifest. I asked for her ticket, but she seemed confused. She wasn't dressed for the cabin, and I thought maybe it was a boarding error. The pause that followed was so long it made her stomach tighten. Mr. Callan tilted his head slightly. Did you verify her name? Erica hesitated. She said her son bought the ticket. She showed me a paper copy, but it looked... She caught herself. It didn't look official. Another long pause. Mr. Callan blinked once. Ms. Trenwood was in the correct seat. Her reservation was prepaid, verified, and noted in the upgrade list. The boarding pass was valid. Erica's lips parted, but nothing came out. The captain didn't even look at her. Mr. Callan's voice dropped half an octave. Ms. Trenwood is the mother of Everett Trenwood. Erica frowned faintly, still not grasping the weight of it. The chairman of this airline. Now the air seemed thinner. Her fingers gripped the cup tighter, nearly crushing it. I didn't know. I had no idea. Mr. Callan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That's the problem. The silence that followed was unbearable. Erica wished someone would speak again, yell, accuse her, even insult her. Anything would have been easier than that voice. Steady, disappointed. You will escort Ms. Trenwood back to her original seat. You will apologize. And when this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive team. Erica nodded quickly, too stunned to argue. Yes, sir. The call ended. The screen went black. The captain didn't even glance her way. He simply said, "You should go now." Erica stepped out of the cockpit like someone walking into court. Her chest felt tight. Her shoes suddenly felt wrong on her feet. She started walking back down the aisle, but everything felt slower. Every row she passed held someone who had seen her earlier. Firm, confident, telling that old woman she didn't belong. Now they would see her again, but this time with her head bowed. Every step forward tasted like acid in her mouth. And up ahead, somewhere in row 28, the woman she had humiliated was still sitting quietly, unaware of the apology that was about to arrive. Marla didn't notice Erica at first. She was staring at the seat back tray, tracing a faint scratch in the plastic with the edge of her thumbnail. Her eyes were heavy, but her mind wouldn't rest. She wasn't tired in the way you get from travel. It was the deeper kind, the weight that comes when something personal is taken from you in public, and you can't fight back because doing so might cost you more than your pride. A deep part of her still wanted to believe it had been a mistake, that Erica had made a quick judgment and would later realize she'd been wrong. But another part, one she didn't like to visit too often, whispered that it wasn't a mistake at all, that Erica had seen her, an older woman, plainly dressed with quiet eyes, and had immediately decided she didn't belong. She had spent a lifetime helping people. She had wiped the faces of crying mothers, stayed past shifts, and missed holidays because someone else needed her more. She had built her life on service, not status. And in a moment, it had all been reduced to a seat number and a silent walk to the back of a plane. So when she heard footsteps stop beside her row, she didn't even look up right away. She assumed it was Ray, maybe coming to offer her a snack or check on something routine. But then she heard the breath, shallow, uneven, and when she finally turned her head, she saw Erica standing there, clutching the back of the seat in front of her like she needed it to stay upright. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Marla watched her quietly. Erica's polished hair no longer looked so tight. Her eyes darted for a second, then landed on Marla's face. She opened her mouth, closed it, then started again. "Ms. Trenwood." Her voice was soft now, unsteady. Marla said nothing. She didn't blink. She just watched. "I owe you an apology," Erica continued, swallowing hard between words. "Earlier I made assumptions about your seat, about you. I didn't check your ID, I didn't scan your ticket, I should have. That was my mistake." Marla's hands were still folded in her lap. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide if she believed what she was hearing. "You were in the right seat," Erica added quickly, "and I treated you like you didn't belong there. That wasn't fair. It was wrong." The people in the nearby rows had gone silent. Even the baby a few rows back had stopped fussing. The soft rumble of the engines was the only sound in the air. Marla took a slow breath. Erica looked like she wanted to shrink, but there was nowhere to go. She glanced at the floor, then back at Marla. "Mr. Callan asked me to bring you back to your seat in first class." Something flickered in Marla's eyes. A slow shift. Not triumph. Never that. But something colder. More tired. She didn't move. Instead, she spoke in the same quiet voice she had used earlier that morning with the TSA agent. The voice she had used 1,000 times at work when she needed to calm someone down. "Why did you think I didn't belong there?" The question landed with a thud between them. Erica's lips parted, but no words came. "I want to hear you say it," Marla added. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sharp, but it left no room for escape. Erica's chest rose and fell. Her eyes shined just a little. "Because you didn't look like the other passengers," she admitted. "You looked like someone who got confused. I made a judgment based on that. I'm not proud of it." Marla sat with that answer. Let it soak in. People nearby were pretending not to listen, but their stillness betrayed them. Marla slowly reached for the armrest and rose from her seat. Her joints ached, and her back had stiffened, but she stood with purpose. She looked at Erica for a long second, not with hatred, but with something that felt heavier, like disappointment wrapped in steel. "You didn't see me," she said. "You only saw what you expected." Then she stepped into the aisle. Erica moved to guide her, but Marla didn't take her arm. She walked on her own, head high, shoulders square. Every passenger she passed watched in silence, most pretending to look elsewhere too late. As she neared the front of the plane again, the space seemed bigger than before, roomier, but also colder. The same seats, the same polished cabin, and yet, everything felt different. Marla returned to 2D and sat down. She adjusted the seatbelt, rested her palms on the armrests, and looked straight ahead. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded anything, but somehow, the entire plane had heard her. Marla sat in 2D again, but this time it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a return to something that had been taken, and returned not out of kindness, but because someone had been forced to face what they didn't want to see. The leather seat beneath her was still warm from the man who had briefly taken her place after she was removed. A faint outline of his back remained impressed in the cushion, and the smell of cologne lingered in the air. Marla adjusted the armrest and sat back slowly, her body stiff, her spirit even stiffer. She didn't feel triumphant, she felt hollow. Outside the small oval window, clouds drifted slowly past, indifferent to the human drama taking place inside. The sky remained unchanged, as if to remind her that up here, above it all, nothing personal mattered. Status, pain, embarrassment, it all looked the same from 30,000 feet. Erica stood a few rows away, uncertain. Her usual fluid movement had been replaced by hesitation. She held a silver tray with water and pretzels, unsure whether to approach. A part of her hoped someone would call her back to the galley, rescue her from this tension. But no one did. Ray, meanwhile, watched from the curtain that separated cabins. She hadn't said anything, hadn't moved, but she noticed every detail. The way Erica's shoulders drooped slightly, the way Marla refused eye contact, the way the other passengers kept stealing glances, then quickly looking away when caught. Ray had seen passengers complain about broken headphones or warm sodas, but no one ever complained about the way someone was looked at. No one filed reports on humiliation. Marla leaned slightly to the side and retrieved her purse. Her fingers found her phone quickly, and she read over the last message from Everett again. "You don't need to speak to her again." She thought about those words now. In some ways, Everett had been right, but she had needed to speak, not to fight, but to make her visible. She hadn't wanted to sit back and let someone else rewrite what had happened, because what Erica had done wasn't just rude, it wasn't just careless. It was a reminder. A reminder of how easily dignity can be stripped with a look, a tone, a decision made in 2 seconds. A reminder that you can work your whole life to be good, to raise a family, to contribute, and still someone can reduce you to nothing in front of strangers, just because you don't look like you fit. She didn't want to carry that feeling home. She didn't want it to be the headline of her trip. So she reached for the call button, not because she needed anything, but because it was hers to press. Erica approached slowly, her face still drawn tight, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Ms. Trenwood?" Marla looked at her, long and steady. "I'd like some tea if it's not too much trouble." Erica nodded quickly. "Of course, right away." It was a simple request, almost ordinary, but the way Marla said it, measured even, firm, made it clear it wasn't about the tea. It was about her reclaiming space, her right to be served with respect, her right to ask without fear of being questioned, to exist in this seat without suspicion. As Erica turned and walked toward the galley, Marla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She pressed her palm flat against the armrest and stared straight ahead again. Around her, the hum of the plane continued. No one said a word. But something had shifted, not just in the seat, in the air. The tea arrived in a ceramic cup resting on a white napkin with the airline's logo printed neatly in blue. Erica set it down without a word, her hand slightly unsteady as she placed the cup onto Marla's tray table. She stood there a second too long, like she might say something more, but then she turned and walked away. Marla didn't touch the tea. Not right away. She just looked at it. The steam curled slowly upward, soft and delicate, disappearing into the cabin air. It reminded her of the early mornings back home, before sunrise, when the house was still and quiet, and her bones ached in that familiar, honest way. She used to make tea then, too. Just 1 cup, sit by the window, think about the day ahead, about her late husband, about Everett and all the ways life had turned out differently than she thought. But still, not badly. Now she was sitting in a chair that cost more than some people's rent, being served by a woman who had tried to erase her an hour earlier. She finally lifted the cup, her fingers wrapping around the warmth. The first sip was sharp, just how she liked it. Not too sweet, not dressed up, just honest. Honest. That was a word that had followed her all her life. She'd always believed in doing the right thing, even when no one noticed. Maybe especially then. In the hospital, she was the nurse who stayed late without being asked, who remembered which patients had allergies, who bought an extra sandwich for the tech who worked double shifts and never complained. No cameras, no recognition, just decency. And yet, when Erica looked at her this morning, all she saw was someone who didn't belong, someone who had wandered in by mistake. Marla knew that pain wasn't just about this flight. It went deeper. It wasn't the first time she'd been spoken to like that, like she needed permission to exist in certain spaces. It wasn't the first time someone younger, with more polish and less experience, decided she didn't measure up. She had been quiet for most of her life, not because she was weak, but because she believed in choosing her moments. And when she did speak, when she asked Erica why she had been judged, she had done it without anger, without theatrics. But the weight of the question had landed like thunder. In the galley, Ray stood near the wall phone, pretending to review the drink log, but her eyes kept drifting toward first class. She had heard the apology, watched the walk back, felt something inside her crack just a little. Ray had been raised by her grandmother, a woman with hands rough from work, a back curved from years bent over stoves and laundry. A woman who never got thanked by the people she served, but always kept her head high. Watching Marla reminded her of her. There was the same quiet pride, the same stillness, the same quiet refusal to be erased. She wanted to say something, not to Erica wouldn't hear it, but to Marla. Just a word, a look. Something that said, "I saw what happened. You were right to stand up." But Ray didn't move. Her job was still new, her position fragile. So instead she scribbled a note on a paper napkin, something small, something private, and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't know if she'd be brave enough to hand it over before landing, but it was there. Meanwhile, Marla sat straighter now. She took another sip of tea and folded her napkin across her lap. She didn't need anyone to announce what had happened. She didn't want anyone to make a scene. But she hoped, deeply, that someone on this plane was thinking differently now. That maybe one person had realized they needed to look longer before deciding who belonged where. Her phone buzzed quietly again. Everett. Just spoke with Callan. Don't worry about anything else, we'll talk tonight. Marla typed her reply slowly. I'm okay. I handled it. Just get home safe. She paused, then added one more line. Thank you for giving me that seat. I needed to remember who I still am. She hit send and leaned back. Her fingers rested on the armrest, not gripping it, just steady. And for the first time since she boarded, Marla Trenwood let her eyes close, not from shame or sadness, but from peace. The flight continued in uneasy quiet, but something had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a silence that felt heavier than before, like everyone on board had seen something they couldn't unsee. Marla's eyes remained closed, but her mind didn't rest. Her body sat calmly, legs crossed at the ankles, hands resting lightly in her lap. Yet inside, emotions still moved in slow, tangled waves. Gratitude, sadness, a trace of anger that hadn't quite faded. She didn't want to dwell, but part of her needed to replay it all, to study it from every angle. Not to hold a grudge, but to understand how something so small could cut so deeply. She had never expected special treatment. That was never her nature. She didn't walk through the world assuming people owed her anything. But today had reminded her that even when you expect nothing, disrespect still lands like a slap, sharp, sudden, and hard to shake. She adjusted her seat slightly, feeling the cushion beneath her shift with her weight. It was a nice seat. Soft leather, wide armrests, a little more legroom than she needed. But none of that made the experience better. The damage had already been done. What made it bearable now was the fact that she had spoken, not with volume, not with demands, but with the kind of voice that leaves a mark. Across the aisle, a woman in her 40s, business suit, silver wedding band, glasses with thick black frames, glanced over at Marla. Their eyes met for a brief second. The woman looked down, then back again. I'm sorry that happened, she said quietly, leaning just enough to be heard. Marla blinked, caught off guard. The woman added, I should have said something earlier. Marla nodded gently. Thank you. They didn't say anything more. They didn't need to. That moment was enough to remind Marla she hadn't been invisible after all. People had seen. Some had stayed silent out of fear, some out of habit, but someone had seen her. The pilot came over the intercom a few minutes later, his voice neutral. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables returned to their upright position. The usual shuffle followed. Passengers adjusting their seats, finishing drinks, returning laptops to bags. Marla took a final sip of her tea. It had gone lukewarm. She didn't mind. She folded the napkin carefully and placed it on the tray. Her movements were slow and precise, like she was putting something to rest. Behind the curtain, Ray's heart pounded. She held the note she had scribbled earlier, just 10 words written in black pen. Simple words, but they carried weight. She stepped into first class and paused beside Marla's seat. The older woman turned to look at her, eyebrows raised slightly, surprised by the interruption. Ray didn't say anything. She just held out the napkin. Marla took it, eyes narrowing just a little as she unfolded the soft paper. She read it once, then again. The words were written in small, careful print. You taught me more than training ever did. Thank you. Marla looked up and Ray gave a faint nod before slipping away, back through the curtain. Marla's fingers rested on the note, folding it twice, then sliding it into her coat pocket. Not because she needed a keepsake, but because it felt like something true, something earned. As the plane tilted gently into descent, Marla looked out the window. The clouds had broken now. She could see land below, tiny homes, roads like thin threads, dots of light beginning to glow in the late afternoon haze. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. She looked older than she remembered, but stronger too, not because of the seat she was in, or the apology she'd received, but because she had stayed rooted when someone tried to erase her. She had chosen not to disappear, and that, she realized, was enough. The landing gear groaned into position beneath the cabin floor, and the subtle shift in pressure made Marla's ears pop. Around her, passengers straightened up, tugged on their seatbelts, checked their phones. The flight was almost over, but Marla wasn't ready to return to the world just yet. The descent felt fast, too fast, like the day was trying to rush past what had happened, but she wasn't going to let it. She rested her hand on the napkin in her pocket. Ray's message still echoed in her chest. 10 quiet words, no signature, no grand gesture, just truth, offered softly, and somehow that made it more powerful. Marla closed her eyes again, not to sleep, but to hold the moment still. She thought of the way Ray had stood there, nervous but brave. A woman who didn't owe her anything, yet chose to speak anyway. It reminded her of the nurses she'd trained back in the day, girls fresh out of school who didn't yet know the weight of silence, who hadn't learned that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't the procedure, it was the pause before doing what's right. She hadn't realized how much she missed being part of something like that, a team, a purpose, a space where doing right quietly still mattered. The captain's voice returned. "We've been cleared for landing. Flight attendants, please take your seats." The plane tilted slightly and the view outside changed. Rooftops now visible, cars moving like ants below. The sun had dipped lower, casting everything in that soft, golden blur that only comes just before dusk. Erica took her seat at the front of the cabin. She fastened her belt with precise movements, her face composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But her mind was anything but still. She stared straight ahead, not looking at the passengers. Her cheeks were flushed, not from exertion, but from memory. She kept replaying Marla's question. Why did you think I didn't belong there? It had hit harder than she expected. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she did. And saying it out loud made it real. She hated that part of herself, the part that assumed, that looked and decided, that sorted people into categories without facts. She had done it for years, and now, sitting here with nothing left to do, she felt the full weight of it. Would she lose her job? She didn't know. But that wasn't the only thing she was afraid of. The worst fear was that what she'd done had revealed something inside her she didn't want to face. Marla's silence afterward hadn't been passive. It had been intentional, chosen. The kind of silence that holds more weight than shouting ever could. And Erica had heard every second of it. When the wheels touched down, a faint bounce jolted the cabin. People sighed with relief, some clapping lightly, others already pulling out their phones, eager to check back into their lives. Marla stayed still. She didn't fumble with her bag or reach for her coat. She just sat, letting the moment settle. The plane slowed as it taxied toward the gate. Flight attendants began reciting their scripted thank you messages, but Marla barely heard them. She wasn't angry anymore. That part had passed somewhere between rows 14 and 28. Now she just felt clear. She had walked through something ugly, and instead of letting it define her, she had faced it. With dignity. She hadn't needed her son to fight for her. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had held the truth in her posture, in her words, in her stillness. And others had felt it. Even the ones who hadn't said a word. As the plane came to a stop, the ding of the seatbelt sign broke the quiet. Passengers rose in bursts, pulling down bags, squeezing into the aisle. First class emptied first, as always, the unwritten rule. Marla stood up slowly, ignoring the rush. She adjusted her coat, ran a hand over her hair, and picked up her purse. Her legs ached, but she moved with grace, each step controlled, deliberate. She didn't look back as she walked down the jet bridge. She didn't need to. Everyone she passed had already seen her, some for the first time. The airport air was colder than Marla remembered, not just from the air conditioning, but from the sudden contrast. The silence of the plane replaced with the chaotic buzz of movement, rolling suitcases, echoing announcements, families gathering, business people striding with Bluetooth in their ears. Life resumed around her, brisk and indifferent. She walked slowly, her flats tapping lightly on the smooth floor, her purse strap tucked securely into the crook of her elbow. Her phone buzzed again in her coat pocket, but she didn't reach for it right away. The noise around her dimmed as she moved toward the baggage claim, each step steady, her mind still processing everything behind her. Every few minutes, she'd pass someone glancing her way, not staring, just that quick, uncertain look people give older women traveling alone. Polite, sometimes sympathetic, occasionally dismissive. It didn't bother her, not anymore. Not today. If anything, it made her stand taller. She noticed her reflection in a large window near gate B12. Her hair had loosened slightly from the braid. A strand of silver curled toward her cheek. Her coat looked worn, her shoes even more so. But her posture was straight. Her walk calm. She looked tired, but unbroken. She studied herself in the glass for a few seconds longer than usual, as though reintroducing herself to the woman who had just walked through fire without a scream. She passed a cafe where people sat sipping coffee, scrolling their phones, arguing softly over gate numbers. No one knew what had just happened 30 minutes ago. No one knew that a flight attendant had yelled, and a mother had been quietly erased. And then, without protest or vengeance, she had walked back and taken her place again. And in doing so, forced an entire aircraft to see something they hadn't wanted to see. She neared the escalator that would take her down to baggage claim, and for the first time she allowed herself a pause. Not from fatigue, but to absorb the weight of it all. Her phone buzzed again. She finally reached for it. A text from Everett. "Callan is furious. Says it'll be handled immediately. Wants a formal apology in writing, wants her reassigned, possibly dismissed." She read the message twice, slowly. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She typed, "I don't need her punished. I just need her changed." Then she paused and deleted it. Instead, she wrote, "I'm fine, really. You did enough by letting me sit in that seat." She tucked the phone away before he could reply. Justice, for her, had never been about someone getting fired. It had always been about clarity, about people seeing the truth and finally naming it. Erica had seen it. Ray had seen it. That woman across the aisle had seen it. And even the ones who said nothing. Maybe, just maybe, they'd think differently next time. The escalator hummed beneath her feet. As it lowered her toward baggage claim, she finally let herself think about home. The old porch swing that creaked when you leaned too far to one side. The framed photo of Everett at his college graduation, standing next to her with that same calm strength. The kettle that hissed too loudly on the stove, and the chipped blue mug she always reached for. The ordinary things. She missed them more than she expected. She reached the bottom of the escalator and stepped off. A few people brushed past her, rushing toward baggage carousel 4. She didn't hurry. Her flight number flickered on the screen above the belt, the conveyor still silent for now. Marla walked toward an empty bench and sat down slowly. She placed her purse beside her and folded her hands in her lap. The noise of the airport faded a little in her ears. She thought of Ray's note again. "You taught me more than training ever did." Those words had followed her more than any apology. She hadn't come here today to teach anyone anything, but maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing quietly still mattered. Maybe there was still power in dignity, in patience, in restraint. The conveyor belt jolted to life, rattling as the first bag slid into view. Marla watched the luggage move slowly around the loop. Her suitcase was small, black worn at the edges with a piece of blue ribbon tied to the handle. She spotted it immediately, rising to her feet as it approached. She waited until it was close enough, then reached forward and lifted it down without struggle. The ribbon brushed her wrist like a whisper. She turned toward the exit, suitcase rolling quietly behind her. There was no applause. No cameras. No loud announcement that justice had been served. Just one woman, walking out of an airport with her head high, her silence louder than anything else. The sliding glass doors parted with a soft hiss as Marla stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sun was beginning to settle into its golden hour, casting long shadows across the concrete. The sky was streaked with a faint wash of orange and pale violet, and the air, though warm, carried that subtle bite of early evening. She paused at the curb, her small suitcase standing upright beside her, one hand resting on the handle. People moved quickly around her, taxi drivers waving signs, families reuniting with hugs and laughter, a young couple arguing over where they'd parked. But Marla stood still, absorbing the shift in atmosphere. It felt like re-entry into the world, one that didn't know what had just happened above the clouds, a world that moved forward without ever really asking who had been bruised along the way. She adjusted her coat collar, the breeze catching at her scarf. It reminded her of winters when Everett was small, how he'd wrap his arms around her leg in the grocery store parking lot and say, "Wind's too sharp, Mama." Even then he'd had a seriousness about him, a quiet knowing. She pulled her phone out and opened his message thread. There was a new one waiting. "Wish I could have been there to walk you out." Marla smiled faintly. She typed slowly, "You were, in all the right ways." She sent it and slipped the phone back into her pocket. A line of yellow taxis stood along the curb, each one flickering its roof light, each driver watching for the next fare. She could have taken one. It would have been easy. But something about the walk to the rideshare pickup area felt right. It gave her time to breathe, to feel her feet on the ground again. The wheels of her suitcase clicked against the sidewalk as she moved through the crowd. She passed a young man wearing a backpack that sagged off one shoulder, earbuds in. A woman speaking Spanish into her phone, dragging two toddlers behind her. An airport worker in a neon vest mopping a spill outside the rental car entrance. None of them looked her way. And that was fine. She didn't need to be noticed. She just needed to keep walking, to carry herself the way she always had, without apology. She thought about Erica again, not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity. The way she had stood, lips pressed together, eyes unsteady, trying to offer an apology that wasn't quite finished. Marla had seen people like her before, young, polished, proud. They moved fast, judged quickly, and rarely stopped long enough to question their instincts. But underneath all that, Marla had sensed something that surprised her. Embarrassment, yes, but also something close to shame. And shame, real shame, wasn't a bad thing. It meant there was still something in her that could be corrected. Still a doorway open for change. Marla didn't believe in punishing people just to make herself feel better. Life had already taught her how fleeting power was, how shallow revenge could be. What mattered more was the turning point. The moment someone saw themselves clearly enough to change. She reached the rideshare lane and sat down on a metal bench beside a sign marked Zone C. Her legs ached now. Her back stiffened slightly when she leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. A group of teenagers nearby laughed at something on a phone screen, the noise loud and youthful. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She thought about her late husband, Julian. He would have called this whole thing nonsense, gotten himself in trouble defending her. He never had patience for ignorance or subtle cruelty, but he would have been proud too, proud that she had kept her ground in her own way, with quiet strength. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Ray. The message was short. "I just got off shift, I meant every word." Marla's fingers hovered for a moment, then replied, "I know you did. You'll go far. Just don't ever stay quiet when you know better." She added a small heart. Just one. Not because she was sentimental, but because she wanted Ray to feel seen, like she had finally felt today. A gray SUV pulled up slowly in front of her. The driver leaned over and rolled down the window. "Marla?" he asked. She nodded, stood up, and placed her bag in the back with careful hands. As she settled into the seat, buckling the belt across her lap, she took one final look at the airport behind her. The tall glass, the sliding doors, the thousands of people who would pass through it and never know what had happened that day in Seat 2D. But she knew. And that was enough. As the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic, Marla looked ahead, her face calm, her spine straight, and her silence full of everything that needed to be said. The city passed by in long, quiet streaks through the tinted window, streetlights flickering on, brake lights glowing red in the growing dusk. Marla sat in the back seat of the rideshare car, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her purse resting against her hip. She watched as people on sidewalks rushed along, carrying coffee cups, talking into phones, holding the hands of children, tugging them forward. She didn't speak to the driver. He had greeted her politely, confirmed her name, then turned the radio down low and settled into silence. She appreciated that. It gave her time to be with herself, to pull apart the knots in her chest that had formed hours ago and hadn't quite let go. The car stopped at a red light. To her left, a bakery's windows glowed with warm yellow light. Inside, a man in a white apron helped an older woman pick out a loaf of bread, wrapping it carefully in paper and tying it with string. The moment was so ordinary it made Marla's throat tighten. How many moments like that had she lived through unnoticed? How many times had she held space for others, made room, stepped aside, kept her voice low so someone else could speak? She turned her gaze to the front again. The image of that first-class seat rose in her mind, how it had felt before the flight attendant's voice sliced through the air. She had been proud, not because of luxury, but because of what it symbolized. Her son had given her that seat. He had said, "You deserve this," not in passing, not as a favor, but as truth. She had walked into that cabin thinking she had finally arrived at a stage in life where she didn't need to explain herself anymore. And in seconds, that belief had been stripped bare. Erica hadn't yelled because of a seat. That much was clear. She had yelled because Marla didn't match the picture in her mind of who belonged there. Marla had spent years teaching Everett to rise above that kind of thinking, to prove people wrong with silence, effort, consistency. And he had. God, had he ever. He had become a man who led quietly, who didn't flaunt his position, who carried his mother's values into rooms where no one expected him to be. But today, she hadn't been the one behind him, cheering him on. Today, she had been the lesson. The car turned onto a quieter street lined with trees beginning to bloom, soft bursts of pink and white catching the last light. Marla's fingers moved gently across her coat sleeve, straightening a wrinkle that didn't need fixing. Her body was still wound with tension she hadn't given herself permission to release. She thought of Erica again. She wondered where she was now, back in the air, in a meeting room, replaying her words. Did she even know how much damage a moment like that could cause? Or had she already decided it wasn't her fault, that it had been blown out of proportion? Marla hoped, truly hoped, that Erica was uncomfortable, not out of cruelty, but because discomfort was the first sign of change. It meant something had gotten through. She also thought of Ray, that note, those 10 quiet words. They had stayed with her like a thread wrapped around her heart. She could have left that plane with only bitterness, but Ray had given her something else, something unexpected. The knowledge that someone was watching closely, that her pain hadn't gone unseen. The car slowed as it approached her street. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "This the right one, ma'am?" Marla nodded. "Yes, thank you." He pulled up gently in front of her house. The porch light had switched on automatically, casting a soft yellow glow across the brick steps. A ceramic pot sat by the railing, her late husband's old habit. Plant something new each spring, even if it didn't survive. Marla stepped out of the car slowly, her knees aching from the stiffness of travel. She reached for her suitcase, offered the driver a soft thank you, and turned toward the walkway. Each step to the front door felt heavier than usual, not because of the weight in her limbs, but the quiet release of holding herself together for hours. She climbed the steps, key in hand, and unlocked the door. Inside, the house welcomed her with stillness. Not silence exactly, just the kind of quiet that wraps around a space where no one else is waiting. She wheeled the suitcase into the front hallway and closed the door behind her. The living room held everything just as she'd left it. The worn armchair by the window, the books piled neatly on the side table, the framed photo of Everett at his first job interview, nervous but trying to look like he belonged. She set her purse down, unbuttoned her coat, and folded it gently over the back of the chair. Then finally, she sat. The room was dim, the last daylight slipping in through the blinds in soft strips across the floor. Marla rested her hands on her knees and exhaled, a long, slow breath that came not just from her lungs, but from something much deeper. The air inside her home felt different, not because anything had changed in it, but because she had changed in it. She wasn't just returning from a trip. She was returning from a moment that had asked her to choose, to shrink, or to rise. And she had risen, quietly, but completely. Night had fully arrived. Outside, the wind brushed gently through the trees, carrying the kind of hush that only comes when most of the world has settled in for sleep. Streetlights flickered in warm amber glows along Marla's street, and the familiar creak of her porch swing moved faintly in the breeze, empty but not forgotten. Inside her living room, she sat alone, wrapped in her old knitted shawl, the one with the frayed edge and fading maroon stripe her husband used to tug playfully whenever she wore it. The lamp beside her buzzed softly as it cast a golden cone of light onto the carpet. Her suitcase still stood near the front door, unopened. She would get to it later. Or maybe tomorrow. Tonight wasn't about unpacking clothes, it was about unpacking something else. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped together. She hadn't cried on the plane, or in the airport, or even in the car. She hadn't allowed herself to, not because she was afraid to cry, but because she had needed to be still, solid, present. But now, in the quiet of her own home, there was no one left to see her shoulders soften, no one to interrupt her thoughts. She closed her eyes. The flight played again in fragments. The coldness of Erica's voice, the sting of walking past the rows of turned heads, the silence from the other passengers, each one carefully choosing to stay quiet. She remembered what that silence had felt like, as if the walls had closed in just slightly, as if the space she took up had become too much. It wasn't new. That feeling had visited her before, when she was the only woman in a hospital meeting, when someone spoke over her at the grocery counter, when people asked Everett what his mother used to do, as if her life's work was a footnote. But this time was different. This time, she hadn't walked away small. She had stood in it, not loud, not angry, but firm. And that had changed something, not just in the cabin, but in her. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't planned to teach anyone a lesson. She had simply claimed her place, quietly, completely. And somehow, that small act had made the entire plane pay attention. She opened her eyes again. The photo on the mantel caught her eye. Everett as a boy, maybe 8 or 9, his hand in hers at a science fair, grinning so wide his cheeks puffed out. Back then she had worried about everything, his future, his safety, whether the world would see him clearly, whether they would let him in. Now, it was him who had opened the door for her, given her the seat, believed she deserved it without needing proof. She reached for her phone and opened his message thread one more time. Her thumb hovered, unsure what to say. Then she typed slowly, "You gave me something bigger than a seat today." She paused, reread the line, then added, "You reminded me who I am." "Thank you." She didn't send it yet. Instead, she looked around the room. Everything here had a story. The teacup on the windowsill with the chipped handle, the throw blanket she'd knitted during chemo recovery, the old radio Everett had repaired in high school, still sitting on the shelf, collecting dust. These weren't just things, they were proof. Of life lived with care. Of years marked not by titles or rooms she sat in, but by the people she had helped, the kindness she had given, the strength she had passed on. The world had looked at her today and seen someone easy to dismiss, but the truth was, Marla Trenwood had built a life so solid, so real, that even humiliation could not shake it. She finally hit send. Then she stood and moved to the kitchen, flicking on the small stove light. She reached for the kettle and filled it with water, placing it gently on the burner. The sound of the flame clicking into place filled the room. She moved slowly, deliberately, grounding herself in every motion. While it heated, she pulled out her favorite tea bag, chamomile and lemon, and dropped it into her old blue mug, the one with the fading gold rim and the tiny crack running from the lip to the handle. She thought again of Erica, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with a quiet hope. Hope that somewhere, in the silence after landing, the woman had thought harder than she ever had before, that she'd remember the look on Marla's face, the strength in her question, the dignity in her stillness. Maybe next time she'd pause before speaking. Maybe she'd choose differently, and maybe Ray would be there to lead by example. The kettle whistled softly. Marla poured the water, let the steam rise, and carried the mug back to the living room. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't check the news. She simply sat, wrapping both hands around the cup, the heat sinking into her fingers, chasing the last bit of cold from her bones. Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, she was whole. Not because of where she'd sat or how others had seen her, but because when it counted most, she had remembered her worth and made the world remember it too. If you felt this story, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe for more real, powerful stories.